Hello ladies of YouTube and welcome to another edition of my videos. Today I wanted to do a study looking at a complete black repertoire with the move 1e6 after white's first move. So the purpose of 1e6 is to allow black to remain flexible and choose a number of different openings against white's first move. So depending on your style, or maybe so much what your opponent plays, if you want to prepare for an opponent, 1e6 allows you to play some calm, less theoretical positions, some sharp very sharp positions which might catch your opponent off guard, or even somewhere in the middle between the two of those positions. But the best thing about 1e6 though is you can play it against anything that white throws at you. But before I rush straight into this 1e6 repertoire, I want you to kind of think about is what is the objectives of the opening? What are we trying to do? Well, we are trying to achieve control maybe of these four central squares. So either getting some pawns in there or some pieces to develop to control these squares in some way. We're trying to get our pieces developed, so maybe get our knights, then our bishops. We're also looking to castle at some point in the game as well. And the final thing that tends to signify the end of development is connecting the rooks up later on in the game. So we make a queen move which often connects up the rooks at some point. So those are the main objectives of the opening. So why 1e6? Well, does this really help us in achieving this plan? Well, let's just have a look at some positions. So let's start with the move 1d4. And here if we play the move 1e6, what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to create essentially a foothold or a preparatorial move in controlling the centres, whether that be in the majority of the cases preparing the move d5, or even preparing the move f5 if we want to play for a Dutch. It can also even be a move to prepare c5, would you believe it, so going into a Benoni. So you can already see that this move, although it doesn't directly control the centre, like let's say if we go back like d5, which immediately controls the centre, we're actually preparing to control the centre by getting ready to play another pawn move like this. Okay, now let's go over some things that white can play. So when you're preparing against white, we want to focus on only really two moves. So that's 1e4, so we need to have some sort of system against that, and 1d4. Now there are other moves that white can play. For example, he can play 1c4, the English, knight f3, f6, sorry. No, f3, what am I talking about? But these two moves that I've just highlighted here tend to transpose back into d4. So really, if you want to cut down on a lot of your preparation, just play what you would against 1d4 and play the same thing against 1c4 or knight f3. Now there are other moves you might have to prepare for. I mean, white has, in essence, I believe is it 20 moves that he can play out of the first move. So he could play, b3 or g3. But here I would say, just focus on classical development. Maybe not so much play this system. But that's up to you to do. These openings will never really come up. So it's better to maybe, if they do come up in a game, to maybe look at it maybe once and not have to worry about it again. But really what I want to focus on is what do we play against these two first moves, so 1e4 and 1d4. So against 1e4, I'm going to be recommending, would you believe it, e6, because that's the purpose of the video. And the same thing against 1d4, I'm going to be recommending the move e6. So against 1e4, 1e6. This goes into what is known as the French defense, and you can already see here it's preparing the move 1d5. So we are essentially letting white gain the center. So after d4, he's now got the full center, but now we strike back and we control the center now. So we've got some sort of stake in the center. We're challenging this pawn on e4, and white has to react in some way. He can't just let us capture this pawn. So we either push it forward, we would exchange it off, or he could even play this knight move. Now, one of the main drawbacks of this system by playing e6, if we even would go back to the first move, even before anything's been played, one of the main drawbacks is that we have developed this pawn on a light square, and generally what we'll find in a lot of positions is that this bishop on c8 tends to get hemmed in. So what we'll find in a lot of the structures and in a lot of the systems, this bishop will end up going to maybe a move like b7, so influencing the center, helping d5 advance at some point in the future. It could even go to a6 in some rarer cases, so looking to maybe exchange off with this other light bishop, which is seen as a better piece than this bishop. Or in some cases, we might even see this bishop come to d7 at some point in the future. So playing a largely defensive role in black's position, anchoring this pawn later on e6. So in a lot of Grandmaster games, this bishop can determine the match. Whether or not black can find effective usage of this bishop can determine whether he'll win or not. And there's so many games where this bishop has not been used effectively in the position, and black is essentially playing down a piece, you could even say, because it's not being used in an effective way. So just bear that in mind when you're playing this system with 1e6. We always got to think about the long-term positioning of this c8 bishop. Okay, so the French defense. Now, why do I recommend the French defense here? Well, before I recommend it, I want to quickly show you a quick sideline. You can also play the move c5, and this can actually transpose into a Sicilian. So if you wanted to play a bit more of a sharper position, then the Sicilian is an option for you. So after the move knight f3, we now go into a Sicilian type position. This has been played thousands of games. Look at it yourself. I'm very limited in my knowledge on the Sicilian, so I don't tend to focus too much on that. But that's just one option for you. Okay, right, so back to where we were. So d5. So why do I recommend the French? Well, the French can play in a number of different ways. We can play for some very calm theoretical positions, or we can play for some very sharp, complicated positions. So in the latter case, I'll show you one example of one of these very complicated positions. So after the move knight c3, so defending the pawn, controlling the center, black can play the move b4, bishop b4, and this can lead into some very complicated lines. So immediately here, black is threatening to capture this pawn, and after this defender of this pawn is taken off, then a capture on e4. So what will happen here is white will play normally e5, so stopping that capture, gaining a lot of space here, and after a move like c5 to continue his assault on the center, white will normally play a3 to kick away this bishop, and here black will often take here. So what we get is black has exchanged off his bishop pair, which maybe can be seen as positional disadvantage. He's created some dark squared weaknesses in the future on his king side, so this can often get exploited with moves like queen to g4. But he argues that actually white's pawn structure really isn't that good. It's all shattered, and he banks on the fact that in the long term, if he can get into an endgame, actually black can actually do quite well here. So these can lead to some very complicated positions. It's probably the most theory-driven positions in all of the French, the Winnower position. There's some gambit lines, particularly in some poison pawn variations, which are really exciting. But look at that in your own time. I think I personally prefer some of the less theoretically challenging lines, particularly because I like to narrow down my repertoire as much as I can, so I can focus on other aspects of the game. So one other line, if you want to go for some really calm, less theoretically driven lines, capturing on here, so this is known as the Rubinstein variation, is a very effective way of playing. So after the knight captures here, one idea that I think I want to have a look at in maybe some future videos, depending on what happens with this video, is to play for the Fort Knox position. So this is a strange move that black can play. He is essentially giving up a tempo. He's breaking one of the rules in opening theory by moving a piece twice, by getting this bishop, sorry, to c6, but exchanging it off later in the position. He is getting rid of one of his worst pieces in the game. He's getting it to an effective square, what tends to happen is white will get a small advantage out of it. So you'll often get a space advantage. Black is having to waste a couple moves in doing this setup. But I think on the other hand, black gets a very solid position. It's called the Fort Knox for a reason. Fort Knox is where US gold, I believe, is kept, and it's one of the most well fortified positions in all of America. So very similar to this, a very fortified black position. So I think in the future I might do some videos looking at this variation. It's very interesting. There are some very calm positions to come out of this. And if you want to go for like a midway house position, so let's say you want a bit of theory, but you don't want too much complications, then the last line I'd recommend is the classical French, and this is a very pleasant line. It's a very popular line as well, just as popular, I would say, as the Winnower. After e5, knight comes back here, and we're looking to. This is very typical French style here. We're looking to create some counterplay. Because the center is now closed up, we've got to be looking at flank attacks. So looking at maybe moves like c5, knight come to c6, queen to b6 to attack the base of white's pawn chain, and later on even coming to look at moves like pawn to f6. So creating further breaks in the center against white structure. The challenge in these variations is always black looking to break down white's center, and white is looking to hold on to its center as much as possible, because it can be argued if white can hold on to the center, he gains a small advantage. He gets a bit more freedom in how he moves his pieces around, and a bit more freedom in his pieces and position. So that's the main challenge in this variation. And it's quite exciting. There's loads of lines in this. I'm only kind of showing you a small snippet of the French, but I think the French is a very exciting position. Particularly if you're learning chess, you can get into some very classical play. It gives you some basic understanding of some imbalances. So looking at the imbalance of this bishop versus maybe this bishop. But it's also a very solid opening where, although we're focusing on some sharp, maybe complicated play, we're also looking after the safety of our king. We're maybe looking to do some early castling and getting some very nice closed positions as well, which is great for learning. Just bear in mind, I think with the French, you're often going to get these closed positions, and also you've got to contend with this bishop here as well. Okay, so I've spent a bit too much time on the French, but you'll find that in sort of 60-70% of your games in this e6 repertoire that you'll tend to get into French positions. So I think it's important to have a look at that first. But after d4 and e6, either white will go back into a French or he'll play for c4. And here there's a number of different positions that black can play here, depending again on his style. So if he wants a very solid, reliable defense, he can look at the Queen's Gambit declined. So here black is just simply doing that normal plan of controlling the center, preventing white from playing the move e4. Very solid. You can play for some really solid lines here. So knight f6, bishop e7, castling, and you can end your repertoire just at that. It's just a nice position, easy to play with as black. The drawback again is, although it's very solid, it doesn't necessarily offer too much sharpness in the position. Black is just looking at solidness really and classical development before anything else. Some other lines, if you don't want to play that, you can play for some more sharper things, so playing for maybe a classical Dutch position. And here there's two options in this Dutch position. You can play for a classical Dutch, which is a nice sort of halfway house in terms of the Dutch defences. So the Leningrad, which is some other variation which you probably won't see here, which is very sharp and very tactical. The classical, which is a bit more of the middle way, again, nice sort of development from black, control of this e4 square. But he can also play for some very solid and very strong defences. So you can look at maybe playing this Dutch stone wall. Again, very popular at club level, a very difficult position to break down for white. If he wants a bit of sharper stuff, he can play for a Benoni here. The Benoni focuses on just trying to break down white's centre. But like with all these defences, we're going to end up with some form of space disadvantage, so just bear that in mind. And I think the Benoni is a good example of this. You know, white is gaining quite a lot of space in the centre, and black is sort of struggling to maybe get a good to break down sometimes white's centre. But again, you know, that's always going to be the challenge in these positions. Just like with the French, if we're able to break down white's centre, we're going to have a very good game. But if we fail to do so, then we're going to maybe struggle a little bit in the position. The final opening I want to quickly show you is obviously the Nimzo. We can transpose into this and a number of other Indian defences. And against knight to c3, we'll play into a Nimzo Indian, so really nice positional chess. We're looking at controlling certain squares on the board, but that's also a very flexible opening that black can play. And after the move, if he doesn't play that, if he plays knight to f3, instead we can play for a Queen's Indian. So getting the bishop on this square, so solving maybe one of the problems that is encountered in a lot of the positions with this bishop immediately. So I hope that was a nice sort of introduction to this 1e6 line. At least I just wanted to show you just some of the plethora of different lines that black can get into in this opening. So to sort of recap, often we'll get into very solid positions. We're creating a foothold for d5 to control the centre. We do often have this weak bishop, which we can either develop onto b7, rarer cases a6, or use it as a defensive piece in a lot of French positions. The French is a fantastic opening, a very solid opening, and if we wanted to maybe complement that with an equally solid opening, looking at the Queen's Gambit decline is not a bad option for yourself. I hope this video was instructive for you. If you do want to see maybe some future videos, particularly me going over some of the Fort Knox lines, just let me know. I will make this some of the things I've discussed in this video available on Lichess, so do look out for that, and I'll share that on the in the description of this video if you do want to have a look at this further. Thank you for watching, guys. Hope to speak to you soon. Take care. Bye.